but all the, what I'm just going to call stuff inside of the building, you may have to replace anywhere from, 5 to 15 times. And when you're talking about a portable x-ray machine, for example, which costs about $250,000, and figure you have several of them and they need to be replaced, say, every 5 years, you can see how over time personal property is really a bigger expenditure than the real property.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we speak with Arthur Kurland, Director of Capital and Asset Management at University Health in Hays. Today, we're going to be talking about ISO certification, specifically around the asset management of personal property. And Arthur is going to have a number of best practices for us. He's going to define some of this for those of you out there who are not familiar with the differences between real and personal property. And then just what it means for the culture of a healthcare organization. We're going to tie it up nicely at the end.
You know what? I'm excited about this because I'm here to learn, because I don't know half this stuff, to be honest with you. So this is going to be good for me. I'll ask questions that hopefully everybody else that doesn't know will be like, that's a good question. And so I enjoy him coming on, and I know everybody else will as well.
Well, they might even say it's a great question, Hays. We'll find out. Everybody stay with us. We're going to be back after a short break with Arthur Kurland, Director of Capital and Asset Management at University Health.
I'm Hays Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
We're speaking with Arthur Kurland, Director of Capital and Asset Management at University Health. And when we're talking about asset management specifically, it's going to be around personal property, giving everyone out there that's listening some best practices, and also highlight ISO certification, which is something that I always get really excited about, Arthur. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Arthur, you and I have a mutual friend in common, Hank Balch, who actually used to work with you. And I thought maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing today.
Sure. So, as you said, I'm currently Director of Capital and Asset Management at University Health. My background has been in accounting, and I have a long history in accounting. And when I interviewed for the position here at University Health, I was excited because I had been reading about the aforementioned ISO standard on asset management. I knew this was going to be a great opportunity for me.
And so we're going to talk about this a little bit later, Arthur, but I think you said you got really excited about ISO, but weren't you also the first hospital to get ISO certification in specifically around asset management?
Yes, that's true. When you talk about asset management, there's a variety of topics that it covers. So, for example, if you were to do a Google search on asset management, you might find things like managing financial market portfolios, stocks, bonds, et cetera, or real estate portfolios. Sometimes even you'll get a result on loss prevention, preventive maintenance, software asset management, a variety of things. And then, of course, fixed assets, which can be real property or personal property. real property is the land and the buildings and everything that's affixed to them. And then personal property is all the things that you can take with you if you were to move, basically the furniture, fixtures, and equipment. And so the ISO standard is really designed for all assets, but most of the asset management industry jumped on it to manage more of the real or plant property. And so when I started looking into it to manage personal property, it was really kind of like a surprise to the people that were in asset management that we would use it that way. And don't get me wrong, they were really excited about it. But yeah, and we were the first hospital globally to certify in asset management for personal property.
Hey, Arthur, this is Hays. And before we get going, I was going to let you know the last couple of interviews we've done, these other two guys have made our guests cry with these very emotional questions. So I just want to give you the heads up that
so
they'll
wrong.
probably get deeper. But my question would be about the certification. Really, like, what are the advantages of having that certification as compared to not having it?
That's a really good question. And so for a hospital and a publicly owned hospital specifically, it really is some assurance to our tax base that we are managing our personal property investments, wisely, being good fiduciary stewards of taxpayer money. So that's really one of the biggest benefits to having an ISO certification, as far as I'm concerned, at the hospital.
And so how long does it take to get that certification? What type of process is it? Is it months? Is it years? What does it take?
Well, that depends on the level of support you have within the organization. So the higher level of support you have, the faster you can do it. If it's something that a frontline staff worker, say, was to try to implement, it would probably be nearly impossible to do. And that's not really the fault of the person trying to do it. It's just the many obstacles that might be in the way, because it takes really the entire organization to coordinate. And sometimes an organization might work in silos where you have particular departments that they don't want anybody butting in their business on how they do things. So if you have a high level support behind it, that you're more apt to get it done because of just really the teeth, behind the effort.
So which ISO certification is it? I guess we should tell everybody so they can reference back if they're interested and not already certified themselves. And also, how broad is that certification? I realize you've utilized it for asset management, but I'm assuming it covers a number of different things.
So the ISO standard is ISO 55000, 55001, and 55002. The actual standard that you conform to is the 55001. That's where the certification is. It is extremely broad. You can use it, like I said, for real property. I've heard some entities wanting to use it for intangible assets, for like software and really any kind of asset. It was designed to manage. So like in the beginning, when I told you what all the definitions of asset management, you could probably use it for any one of those. As far as personal property is concerned, we have defined a life cycle for our personal property assets, everything from acquiring them to storing them, to moving them, to inventorying them, to disposing of them. So each one of those life cycle activities is covered under our ISO certification.
So you talked a little bit about the difference between what real property and personal property is, but I would also like to go even deeper on qualifying that personal property. Like, how much equipment and supplies, et cetera, are we talking about? within, I mean, it doesn't have to be your hospital, but in an average sized hospital? How much are we talking about?
Like a lot of answers, it depends on the time frame you're talking about. So over time, personal property will be more of an expense than real property because the lifespan of personal property is just shorter. And so you have to replace very expensive equipment a lot more often. So for example, a building might be expected to last 40 or 50 years, but all what I'm just going to call stuff inside of the building, you may have to replace anywhere from, 5 to 15 times. And when you're talking about a portable x-ray machine, for example, which costs about $250,000, and figure you have several of them and they need to be replaced, say, every 5 years, you can see how over time, personal property is really a bigger expenditure than the real property.
And Arthur, thanks for sharing that too. As I learn about this ISO certification, which a really good detail, and thank you for helping me understand what it was, what it is, and how it works. But I think about capital planning a lot. Like budgets come out every year. The nature we're in right now, I'm sure capital is really, really looked at very deeply right now with all the extra costs we have right now and the state of affairs in the world right now. But as we depreciate that personal property, how important is a system, a hospital, a critical access, an ASC, in really truly understanding their property that's depreciating at the CFO level to really fill into that capital budgeting planning?
It's extremely important. If you're not managing your property, first of all, you really don't know what you have. You don't know how long you've had it. So in terms of budgeting, it helps to know how long you've had a particular category of equipment so you can plan on replacing it. When you don't manage things properly, there's a lot of errors that can occur in accounting. So for example, you might be depreciating a piece of equipment and say something goes wrong with it. Well, if the department returns it to the vendor on their own for another one, and that goes somehow through the accounting system, you may end up having two of these items depreciating on your books when you really only have one of them. And then that works the other way around, So you might be depreciating something that was in a department that just decided just to get rid of it. So now you don't have anything at all, but it's still depreciating.
Huge. And just another follow-up to that, Arthur. How much is break fix discussions part of that in the ISO certification, or how much is that a part of this overall concept too?
I think that would be dependent on the organization, on what their level of acceptance would be. I really can't answer that because maintenance really isn't a part of the ISO standard. Let me just take a step back and just talk a minute about, you asked me about the benefits and I told you, it's assurance for our tax base. But internally, there's a benefit in terms of our employee satisfaction. So before we did this, we would have, say, an asset in a clinical area that breaks. So the people in the clinical area would call whoever they thought might be the person to take care of it, say in IT, and then IT would tell them, oh no, that's something in biomed. And then they would call biomed and they would say, no, that's part of, field engineering. And it just goes on and all that time is just wasted, and it gets frustrating for our people that are supposed to be taking the time to take care of our patients. And so now they have one place to call, regardless of what the asset type is. They call us, and then we handle it. So that allows the people in a clinical settings to focus on patients.
What I love about that is, to your point, that single point of ownership, because they're going to call who they think is supposed to take care of it. So what does that current state look like? Like, I think a common department that people think of, especially in that break fix scenario, would be like clinical engineering or biomedical engineering. Maybe if it's a very IT software driven type of device. They might call, IS. I think in some cases, if they're just very friendly with materials management and that's who they call for everything else, then they call there. But what is some of the, I realize I'm kind of answering a little bit of my own question, but what other color would you add to the current state, when things are siloed the way you're describing instead of having a central point of ownership?
So yes, you made a very good point. A lot of hospitals use materials management for asset management, and it's really two completely different things. Based on what I've heard and know, materials management, their primary function is to get supplies out to the clinical areas of the hospital. So when it comes to asset management, it's kind of sits on the back burner and is addressed when they can get to it. And sometimes it's a very long time. So with a dedicated asset management department, it takes that pressure off of the materials management department, and it gets to resolving personal property issues rather quickly. For example, so when I first got to the hospital here, University Health, I used to come in through the dock areas, and there would be just stuff on the dock, like filing cabinets or broken task chairs or broken desks and things like that. And, I would just walk past it and keep moving. And the next day, that stuff would be there and more stuff would be there. And like almost daily, it would just accumulate. And I asked the dock manager, where's this stuff coming from? And he was telling me, that just during the night, the people working in the hospital would just bring it down and just leave it there. And then it would get to the point where the dock was so crowded of stuff, they couldn't even move around, and they ended up just doing whatever they could with it, mostly just throwing it in the dumpster.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that was kind of like the first thing we addressed, is making sure things were arriving that was being ordered, and then things were being disposed of properly. And so we got to the point where that's where we initially had our focus, and we were certified on the acquisition, receiving of assets, delivery of those assets to the departments that were ordered it, and then the disposition of those assets. And then once we got certified in that, we expanded our scope to include other areas of the life cycle. So that's one of the nice things about this ISO certification, the standard. It allows you to create your own scope, and then you continuously improve and then get better and expand the scope.
I also want you to describe that dock that was loaded with, broken items and things. It's not ideal. So what is ideal? What is like a best practice that you would suggest? And a follow-up to that is, how do you track all this stuff? You've got different floors, you've got different departments, you've got different hospitals. How do you actually track that? Do y'all use a software program for that that's in-house, or what do you do?
So how do we dispose? Well, first of all, the goal is to get the most value out of the asset. So we kind of go through a sequence. So if a department doesn't want something, the first thing we do is assess it to see if it might be good to be used in another department. And so we have internally a website for surplus assets where departments can look to see if they have something before they go ahead and buy something new. So, and we track that. So we know we're saving a lot of money just by reutilizing assets that aren't needed in one department. Then if the asset is good, but nobody wants it, our next move is to auction it. So we have a website, a third-party website that we use that will auction our unneeded items that are in good condition. And then the third option is we recycle. So if we have metal or anything that's recyclable, we take it to recycling. And then finally, if it's just total garbage, and it's usually this category will fall into like just furniture, like bookcases that just fall apart. We have to discard it. So, I mean, the objective is just not to dump things into landfills and to get the most we can out of the assets. So we pay nothing to dispose of our stuff. Companies pay us for all of our stuff, either recycled or, of course, auction. And so in answer to your second question, yes, we have a database. So we track all of our assets with a barcode tag. And so, and they get tagged the moment they come in on the dock. And we have a standard on what it is we tag, based on a dollar threshold. And of course, if it's capital, it automatically gets tagged. But this goes kind of deep because the disposition part of it really begins at the beginning, at the acquisition part. And so we've standardized the way we acquire assets. So we have a catalog that our people use when they requisition new assets so that everybody calls everything the same. So for example, if somebody wanted a laptop, if we didn't standardize, they might call it a notebook or a portable PC or who knows what. So we've standardized descriptions. So everybody calls a vital signs monitor a vital signs monitor. It's not, an MX800 or whatever the department language is. So that's the first step, is that everything is standardized in terms of a description, and then it's tagged based on a certain cost threshold. And so it's tracked in a database. We use a database throughout its life cycle. So when it's received, we have all the PO information. And if the PO says we have 10 of these, we should have 10 asset tags assigned to them. And those stays with the assets throughout their life cycle. So when we finally do dispose of them in one of those methods I described, we know, what it cost when it came in and what we got for it, if anything, when it was disposed through its entire life cycle, where it was located. So our database has all that location information in it by department.
I have a follow-up question to that on, we're talking about personal property and tagging and the PO database and where things are. How does consignment fit into this category, from sets to equipment, or if there's a consignment setup? Does that fit into any of your categories, or do you have any thoughts on that as well?
So are you talking about like leased equipment that?
It could fall under leased. It could fall under consignment, where reps bring in pieces of equipment and let it stay there, and it's tagged and it's tracked, but it's not actually. It's not
hospital.
It's generated
owned.
Yeah, go ahead. Loan.
It's just not
loaner.
Hospital owned. Yeah, it's like loaners. Yeah, consignment.
So we have a separate set of tags for leased assets. Like pumps and things like of that nature, and we work closely with other departments. So if it's being returned, we'll know about that too. Another thing we do is we have what we call advocates, kind of like a safety department might have safety advocates in all the departments. Well, we have asset management advocates. So we have like over 300 departments, and we have about 170 advocates. So an advocate might cover more than one department, in other words. And so every month we communicate with our advocates. We send them a little survey. It's only like 5 questions. It's a Survey Monkey. And it asks them questions like that. It's like, did you receive any assets that wasn't tagged? And they're all yes or no like this. Did you return any assets without a return merchandise authorization number from procurement? Things like that. So all the answers ideally would be no. And so when we do get a yes, we follow up on those.
Are all of the tags RFID tags, or do you have different types of tagging depending on what the asset is?
Yeah, all of our tags are barcode. Our biomed department does utilize RFID, but that's part of the beauty of working so closely with these departments, because even like IT, they manage their own IT equipment. Biomed manages biomed equipment, but they share their information with us. So every month we get a report of, let's just take biomed, for example. They, perform preventive maintenance. They calibrate equipment, things of that nature. So everything that they touch, we consider is being accounted for and inventoried. And so every month they send us a report of all the stuff that they touched. And so we update our database with that information, what they touched and where it was. And that's helps us with our inventory.
What I love about this is I didn't really understand when you and I first kind of touched base about the podcast. I didn't even fully understand that you were overlapping with all of these departments versus just taking on full control. And I can see why this breaks down the silos so well, is the silos are still there. You're just kind of the glue that makes sure that this overarching process is executed properly from one silo to another, but then is also housed all together under one plan and one database, essentially, the master data set that you're able to use to make sure that you understand the total cost of ownership through the life cycle.
Yeah, I'm smiling right now because you got it. You hit the nail on the head. You call it glue. I call it the hub in the wheel. And all those spokes are the communication. Yeah, we let the departments do what they do. We just ask that we be included and we share information.
That's excellent. I think that's the real key. I mean, we had a conversation not too long ago with a guest, Vin Matozo, about interoperability. And a lot of that conversation was around creating interoperability through automated systems and then having those electronic systems, automating, I should say, the communication between disparate electronic systems, so that you could do something like tie contracting, purchasing, et cetera, all the way from that initial steps to value analysis through to the end on rev cycle and ongoing contract management and analysis. I kind of see this very similarly, but instead of trying to create like these APIs and, connections between electronic systems, not that you might not be doing that, but this is almost like the human version of interoperability.
Yep, agreed.
Well, I'll tell you what, Arthur, you did a fantastic job, not only with the interview today, but for taking your organization through the ISO certification. And I also have to just give you a lot of credit for being willing to share that experience and your insights, with the industry by coming on. Just so everybody knows, I put out a post that got a lot of hits on LinkedIn just saying, we were looking for people who had success stories or something that they were passionate about that they wanted to share with the industry. And Arthur, you were one of the first people to reach out. And, I think that's the beauty and the value of social media, but it also requires people to be willing to share their secret sauce to some extent. And so I want to make sure we give you lots of credit for doing that and for reaching out and responding to my post and saying, yeah, I've got something I'm passionate about and that I want to talk about. And I want to encourage others to follow in your footsteps as well. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. I think I'm doing a public service, really. I think all hospitals should do something like this. It just improves the employee experience, the patient experience. There's no downside really to doing it. There's only benefits to it.
Yeah, and the fiduciary stability too, and understanding the insight around how, cost loss. Boy, is that a huge one right now. I mean, I can just see how big of a deal that is for your organization, and for the fact that you were already in place for that while others may be trying to catch up is a pretty big deal for the environment we're in today.
Yeah, I agree. And the certification part of it, really, at a hospital, there's lots of certifications that we have to go through, Joint Commission, et cetera. So when these departments understood that we wanted to become certified, they got it. They didn't want to be the reason why we didn't get the certification. So that helped in gaining their cooperation.
That starts with good leadership and on your part to be able to get multiple units, multiple people all together in order to do that. So I applaud you for that. Thank you for reaching out. And the last thing I'm going to say is you didn't cry one time. You are very strong.
Be strong.
I'm impressed. And thank you very much. Sincerely. It was great.
Well, you got to have a thick skin when you work in asset management.
Yes, you do. All day long.
Absolutely.
Oh, my gosh.
Thank you.
That was Arthur Kurland, Director of Capital and Asset Management at University Health, and we talked about ISO certification and some best practices. And I think at the very end, one of the things about having conversations like this is sometimes the information that we have might be something other people have done, but they might not have done it in exactly the same way. There may be organizations out there that are structured similarly to Arthur's, where they have an asset management team that sort of is the glue or the spokes that connect all the different departments that are managing those assets. But I think one key piece, and I know that there are going to be lots of people out there who listen to this that are not ISO certified, a common struggle for supply chain is mastering this internal stakeholder engagement, because it's always a dotted line. There's not an org structure where all of a sudden your career path or your compensation or anything like that in biomed is at all impacted by how you're interfacing with supply chain or an asset management team, as a component of that, or purchasing. And so that's where I think some of the difficulty in engagement. Now, Arthur said it was super important to get senior leadership buy-in, but there's this other piece of it is engaging the internal stakeholders. And what I love about it is, hey, we're going for this ISO certification. We want this really bad. We think this is going to be baked into process improvements for us. And all of a sudden, everybody around and in the institution that touches that asset management team starts to pull for them. It's like a rallying. It's almost like your local football team never having made, states or the playoffs. And then all of a sudden you've got that upstart team and they're about to go kill it. And you want that state title. The whole town, where they never showed out for one game, is all of a sudden packing the stadium. And it's a great way to get everybody involved and make them want to do it. So I just think that was masterful work by Arthur, and also that he recognized how critical that ISO certification was to helping and get, internal engagement throughout his healthcare organization, Garry.
Justin, you said it. It's a mouthful. Asset management is a mouthful. And Justin, just reiterating what Arthur had said, it is from senior leadership all the way to boots on the ground. And we talk about asset management. He talked about it's patient-centered. It truly is. And really having the key people involved to help support that mission and the fiduciary responsibility, it is a pain to tag. It's a pain to track. It's a pain to see when it depreciated. But if you're looking at the entire system, the entire hospital, whether it's an ASC, it is so important to have this dialed in. And that ISO certification was an education that I learned about, and I hope the end users will take a look at the 55,000, the 55,001, the 55,002. I heard it. But Justin, you said it well, and really happy to have Arthur on the podcast today. I think we'll get some people really questioning some information about this one. So great interview.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode. As a reminder, you can support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for Power Supply Media Podcast on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes, but you got to download the smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there downloading it from your app marketplace, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Garry, Hays, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.